So here's what we're going to cover. We're going to spend a lot of time on capacity reporting in OpenAir. I've got examples that I've set up in a test environment for you to be able to see like realistic data in the system. And then we're going to touch a little bit on how do you deal with things like products and services or skill sets. And of course, something that's typically around the resource scheduling piece of it, but how do you account for non-scope time as your capacity factor? So how do you factor that in, and some ideas around that. Right. So we'll get right into it. To me, capacity means the staff that you have available to deliver services. So that's Jody's definition. And the way that I think of capacity is in actually 3 different measures. The first measure is just by head count, full-time head count. So if you have 2 part-time people, that's 1 person or 1 FTE. So usually the number of head count that you have, the full-time equivalent head count, is a good measure of capacity. The second is the number of hours that are available to be delivered. And that starts falling into things like company holidays and vacation allowances. Maybe you have targets for people to hit. So the hours is a lower detail version than the head count because now we have sort of an individual hour equivalent to the resources that we have on staff. And the third way I look at it is money. So not only how many hours do I have to deliver, but if this person was hitting a typical bill rate or average bill rate for that role or level or job category, what's the revenue that we could get? And that starts tying into things like your backlog reporting, where you have sold, 15 installations of something, and you're looking at the people who could do the installs, and so you're looking at not only effort and hours, but also a money perspective to see if you have enough headcount to hit to reach your backlog money targets that you have in place. Right. Now, along with each of these, there are ways that you can get that type of information out of OpenAir, and some of you may already know this information, and some of you may not have realized it was actually there. So from an FTE or a full-time equivalent situation, the full-time equivalent considers the work schedules that you have. So there are standard FTE reporting values in OpenAir. They're called assigned FTE, there's assigned FTE emphasized, booked FTE emphasized, and if you haven't seen those before, they're part of the resource, bookings and assignment area. So I'm going to go into a report. And I'm in the, by the way, I'm using the new navigation of the system. There's been some really nice enhancements in the October release. If you haven't checked that out yet, it's turning on in production this weekend. And I also use the report management interface because I like the key search things like this. So if I typed FTE, you can see I have assigned FTE as reporting values. I've booked FTE in the resource area. So OpenAir will do the math for you to figure out the full-time equivalent based on the work schedules that are assigned to the people or the generics that you have set up in the system. Now, to complement that, you want to know how many people you actually have on staff. So that's good from a scheduling perspective. I know, what my assigned FTE or my booked FTE is coming out to be, but how do I know how many people I have? So there is actually a standard reporting value, but it's on the job code. So it's not by person, it's by job code. And I may have worked with a few of you to try and get this on the user record. It's a little more difficult. But there's a standard reporting value on the job code called quantity, and it's not an FTE per se, but it's a person. So it counts. Each person counts as 1 in the system. So there's a quantity on staff and a quantity of generics, and it knows the difference because a staff is an actual user account where you can log in, and a generic, as you may know already, is a type of resource that you can use in scheduling, but you can't have actual time, and it's not a user license in the system. So right away, that gives us an ability to run an FTE report where we can just run a detailed job code report and say, based on the job codes I have in the system, how many do I have on staff in each of these job code areas, and how many generics am I planning for in the system. I think the staff is more relevant in the system, but what's interesting about this job code is it is very sensitive to just data in the system. So when you run a job code detail report, you have to actually make sure that you're not including any inactive people, because it will add those to the count. So if you exclude the inactive resources that you have on staff, well, they're not on staff, obviously. If you exclude the inactive resources, then you get an accurate count of the number of users you have in the system. Unfortunately, this is number, not FTE. So there's a little bit of a translation that you have to do, but it does at least give you a number to look at. And for those of you who have primarily full-time people, it is a useful metric. Those of you who have mostly part-time people, you may have to do a little bit of a number conversion in your head as you're looking at reports where this is comparing data. Okay. And if you haven't actually tried running a job code detail report, that's actually, I've got this saved here. So the job code detail report that I have here, this capacity quantity report, if I just run it here, it gives me what I just showed on the slide deck. Okay. Now, there's another way to get to this, and what I've worked with some customers on is to be able to get it from a count perspective, like how many. So it's not using this quantity field, it's doing a count so that you can use things like filtering and include only certain people, and therefore the count comes out right, so you don't have to use that exclude inactive entities if you don't want to. When I say count, what I mean is I'm actually using the roll-up option in the system. Oops, I'm on the wrong slide here. This is what I mean, alternate approach. So I can leverage this roll-up count option on something like a user report, and I can filter by user information, and then I can use the roll-up to be able to count how many I have. So I get the same numbers, but I'm doing it a different way. So I'm not using that quantity field because that's a detail field. I want to use the count and roll-up feature in the detail report. So I have that in a report like this. Where if you're not familiar with the detail roll-up option, this is that roll-up checkbox that you get when you're running detail reports. And it gives you the ability when you run it to basically count whatever it is you're trying to report on. So here I'm reporting on job code, and so that I get the same numbers 4 and 13 on my job code counts that matched with my quantities, because it's really just doing a count in the system. Now the slide that I quickly skipped over because I wasn't talking to it correctly, this one is actually how you can combine those standard FTE reporting values with the quantity field. So you can do a visual review to see, do I have the right staff for what I'm seeing as far as forecast, for example. So in this report, you can see I have that job code quantity on staff being pulled in, which is that standard reporting value. And then in the October, November, and December, I'm actually pulling in a booked FTE standard reporting value, which is doing the math based on people's schedules to figure out what is the total head count that we are forecasting as being needed in the organization. And then you can just look at the numbers across the board and make sure you're right sized to be able to support that, that value. So this report is also a very simple report to put together. It's sort of bleeding into our next week's discussion, which is capacity versus demand. But if I look at how I set up this report, I didn't do any custom calculations. This is all standard reporting values in the system. So I'm pulling in resources booked FTE, which is the calculation that's using the work schedule for each of the resources. I'm only bringing in people that are currently employed, so I'm using an entity tag filter. And I'm bringing in my quantity on staff value for the job code, so I'm still rolling things up by job code. Of course, I could choose to subtotal by user and all that kind of stuff if I want, but I'm keeping this very simple and running this report so I can see the numbers side by side along the way with the different job codes and how I'm scheduling those types of resources based on my generics and my named users in the future. Okay. But that's just for FTE. So what I see quite often is capacity being looked at not only from an FTE, but really more from an hours perspective, because hours tends to also give you insight into things like utilization and scope and effort and planning and all that kind of stuff. So hours are what I usually see customers wanting to get to, and there are a number of hours that you can report on in OpenAir. The two primary hours that define capacity as far as hours available for delivery are the work schedule hour reporting values. There's one called base work schedule hours, and there's one called work schedule hours. And they look and sound very similar, but the base work schedule is the first part when you define a work schedule in the system, the hours per day. And that's all it is, hours per day. Then there's a section on the work schedule that allows you to put exceptions in. That's typically where people are putting holidays. That is, in turn, the work schedule hours. So if I pull up a work schedule here, this first part here exclusively, without considering any of the exceptions, this would be considered base work schedule. So in this example, we're looking at a 20/80 schedule, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, 52 weeks in a year, 20/80. The work schedule then takes all of these exceptions out of the calendar. So now we have a reduced effort for the work schedule. For those of you who are not putting holidays in your work schedule, then these two reporting values will equal the same thing. Okay. But if you are putting holidays in from a capacity perspective, realistically, holidays are non-working days. So if you want to be accurate on the available days that are available, hours that are available to deliver, what you really want to look at is your work schedule hours, because that's more realistic for capacity, because we know people are not going to work on July 4th or Christmas Day or other holidays that are in other countries as well. Okay. So you can run reports on these just to look at the work schedule hours, and this reporting value does support entity tag filtering. So if you use entity tags on the user record to indicate when people started or ended employment with you, it will ensure that you have accurate work schedule hours by using an entity tag filter in the system. And that's what I have in this example report here. This company-wide capacity report for work schedule hours. I'm just bringing in those two work schedule hours, and you can see them month over month, the comparison of values, because you can see how the base work schedule is either equal to or higher than the work schedule hours. Now that's fine. The work schedule hours is fine. So that gives you full time. So 40 hours a week or 32 hours a week if there's holidays or something like that. So that gives you a capacity of hours that your staff can deliver. But if you factor in sort of utilization considerations, there's a feature called target utilization. Target utilization allows you to define a percentage of a person's work schedule that they should actually be billable. So now you're adding another refinement to the whole calculation, because what you're doing is you're saying, I understand that you're full-time, but I need you to at least work 30 hours of billable work, because that's the work that's bringing money into the company. So now we can have a capacity that's like billable hours capacity versus just the number of hours that you're hired to work, right? By using the target utilization feature, OpenAir automatically gives you two additional reporting values. One's called base target hours, and the other is called target hours. And you could pretty much guess the correlation of those. But the target utilization feature will take the percentage that you enter in, and it will multiply it by either base for base target hours or work schedule for target hours, and come up with the hours that that person could be billable and productive according to that target that you've set for them. So now you get a refined value of the number of hours that you think your team can deliver based on them achieving their targets. Okay, and that would give you a way to plan against the type of work coming in if you're doing early planning of hours of work along the way. And as you can see in the example report here, I won't run that one again, but it's the same thing. I'm just showing you all the hours side by side. And in the case of target utilization, in the system that I'm running this in, most people are set to 75%. So you can see it's a significant hit on the utilization work schedule hours. And this also helps you accommodate for people who maybe are on long-term leave, or they have a refined schedule where we need to, temporarily reduce their utilization, or they're in a job that actually does a little bit of everything and they're not always available. Okay, so you can get a more realistic capacity from those from an hours perspective. And the last aspect is the money piece of it. So the money piece of it gives you the ability to say, okay, so that's great. I know how many hours, and I see what kind of work's coming in, so I can see how many hours we need to deliver. But a lot of times, opportunities or work that's coming in has more of a financial or a money value, backlog money value for delivery. And so you can convert your capacity into money by using things like the capacity hours that we just talked about, and identifying some kind of bill rate expectation and just doing the math in the system with some custom calculations. Now, bill rates may vary by the type of resource or the type of work, so this becomes a little bit of a subjective decision on how to set this bill rate. But the bill rate can be set by user, or it can be something that you're like, you know what, everyone should be hitting X, a system-wide target. I find most often a user-level bill rate control is best, because you may have those executive people who have low utilization or low targets but high bill rates versus associates or consultant-level resources that have high utilization but may have lower bill rates. And that way you can do the math in OpenAir to be able to get a realistic how much money or revenue could I drive if people hit their target bill rate and their capacity that I'm expecting, or their target capacity. And by just having that be set up in the system, now you get a forecast control based on the way staffing is. Maybe you're expecting people to roll off the company or to join the company, and now you can sort of plan out what can I achieve as far as a revenue with this type of capacity reporting in the system. Now, the bill rate piece of it, like where do you put that? So there are really kind of two options for putting a cost level or a bill rate on a user record. One is you can always create a standard, a custom field. The custom field is available in custom calculations. So you can have a currency field on the user record and fill that in. But the other option is to use the cost levels that come with OpenAir. If you're not familiar with it, the cost tab on the user record can actually support up to 3 different levels of cost. To enable this, you may end up having to talk to your account manager just to be aware of that. But the 3 levels of cost, since many companies don't really need to track 3 levels of cost, what we usually can do is we can take one of those levels and just repurpose it and call it target bill rate, or expected bill rate, or average bill rate, or whatever we want to call that. So the terminology override feature in OpenAir allows us to rename this money value. Even though it's a cost table, it's a money value. And the nice thing about using this feature is the cost fields on this cost tab are already built in with standard reporting values like timesheet cost, forecast booking cost, work schedule cost. Anything with a cost value can actually be reported with this target bill rate. So you're not really reporting on cost, you're reporting on potential bill rate or capacity billing, okay, type thing. So in the system, I set up a little report that allows you to see the work schedule cost and the base work schedule cost in the system. So let me show you that. And so here, based on my projected base work schedule or projected work schedule cost using my target bill rate that I've set up on individuals, I get a projection of money that the company could earn or deliver on if people were hitting their target bill, their bill rate. Now, that's with the work schedule hours. So if we want to bring it down to the capacity refinement that we just talked about using the target utilization, actually OpenAir doesn't natively factor in the cost for the target versions of those hours. So you can actually set up custom calculations to reproduce. These two reporting values are actually custom calculations that I built, which are taking the base target hours or the target hours and multiplying it by the bill rate, the target bill rate that I have in the system per user. So I'm turning around and getting the target version of the money just like I had the target version of the hours. And that's done simply by setting up custom calculations so that I can get the target bill rate first by backing into it. I can forecast the work schedule, divide it by the work schedule to be able to get the rate, and then I use the rate to turn around and multiply it by those standard reporting values here, base, target, and target. And that's how I get target money available. And once that's all said and done, it can go on to a report, and now I can actually compare this target with my backlog. And I'm able to see, do I have capacity and expected bill rate achievement to be able to deliver on the backlog that I'm seeing from a forecasting perspective. So everything sort of kind of comes together in that view. Okay. And here's an example where we see that. Where we see I'm projecting that we could deliver 136.5. If everyone hits their target, it drops down to 90. Right now the forecast is showing 66. I am completely covered in capacity. I'm a little tight here on the management type resources because we're overscheduling those resources, so I may want to consider training people up or delegating or sharing work between those two because this is a little too close for comfort. You know, when numbers match like this, that means it can only go up, I guess, or down. It's like as the case may be. Okay. Now, as we get near the end, the other two topics were how to do a capacity by product and service. So this is where we start factoring in the resource profile and the skill database stuff. So how do I know, okay, that's great, I use job code, and job code gives me some level of category. I could also roll it up by team and something like that. But if I want to basically look at, like, what are the skill sets I have, what are the kinds of services I can provide, the skill database actually gives us an ability to do that roll-up using that roll-up feature in the detail report. And the profile attributes and the profile names give us the ability to add counts. So how many people have the skill set? How many people have experience in using OpenAir in all these different types of expertise levels? And it doesn't give you, like, oh, it's 25% of Jody and 50% of Ron or anything like that. But it gives you basic counts so that you know from your staff how many people know Soligo, how many people know Transaction Pro. And those are things that you would have to consider if you're bringing more work on in certain areas. So how do you know that you need that kind of skill for that kind of work? I'm suggesting that you start tagging your projects by the type of work that's needed. It could be a type of skill set. It could be a type of product. It could be an offering. Soligo integrations, Delbumi integrations, QuickBooks integrations. Those things imply certain skill sets, and therefore if you used a tagging on that project, you would be able to see the money that's coming in, and then you'd be able to look at the head count that you're getting and know based on your capacity numbers whether you'll be able to deliver on those projects or not. Okay, so lots of different pieces and to put together the full puzzle for capacity management. And then finally, from an accounting perspective, how do you account for things like unproductive time? So that's generally what target utilization is all about. How do I make sure that people are hitting a target and I'm accommodating the fact, the man month or person month metric where people are unproductive a certain percentage of the time during a day. And that's what target utilization tends to capture. But then what if you have people who, they have a target, but they're able to meet that target because they have a general effort set aside to do customer support or to do sales support or to do demo building. And those are all things that help the company at the end of the day. If you need to sort of share resources and you want to be very accurate in the contribution of people and the capacity of hours in those different areas, so a single person can be a contributor to multiple areas, you may want to introduce this allocation grid custom field, because what it allows you to do is basically put percentage of sharing of a resource among the types of work that they can do. And when you introduce an allocation grid, there's a standard reporting value in OpenAir that adjusts all financial money values to have a consideration for that allocation grid split. If you haven't used this feature before, it's on the settings area of the report. Let me find my split report here. So by having an allocation grid, there's a whole other set of report values called allocation grid generated fields. Okay, and you get an include and exclude option. By default, everyone's is set to exclude. If you turn it on to include, what happens is every reporting value that has money, whether it's billing or cost or whatever, you will get a variation of that that has not only the native value, but the native value split out by individual values inside that allocation grid. So when I run this report, you can see in this example when it comes back, I set myself up so that I'm being shared between management and delivery. So even though my target is X, I'm actually not, my target is 75%. I'm not 75% committed to delivery. I'm 75% committed to the company, but I'm only doing 60% of delivery work. So I should actually reduce my capacity money and my capacity money by another percentage, so I can be realistically factored into how much can I actually deliver. I don't see this requirement very often, but some people definitely have that situation where they want to accommodate half a head or a quarter head, and the allocation grid would give me that ability. So instead of being able to deliver like 21% or 21,000 potential dollars as a resource, I'm really only able to do 13 because I'm partially shared with, customer support and sales. So I'm only at a 65% delivery impact for capacity. So that definitely takes it to an advanced level, but it is possible in OpenAir. So as we wrap up and open it up for questions, just know that capacity means different things to different people. I think of it in terms of headcount, hours, and money. And the comparison of that capacity to demand many times is based on scheduling or backlog. So there's a lot of standard reporting values that you can factor in and custom calculations that you can come up with to meet the capacity reporting needs that you're looking for. Okay. I do think skill profiles fall into this mix a bit, and there's been lots of enhancements in the skill database area, the resource management, resource module area of the tool. So that can start factoring in, and of course you can always filter on that kind of stuff as you're looking at resource availability. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the recording and I'm going to open it up for general questions and comments.